Oh, hey, it's me again. Yeah, don't worry. Either Alex or Natalie is going to come around again next week and make it all better. But for today, my friends, if you've sent mail to Farmer Jesse or Farmer Jackson or anybody else in the back of the house of this podcast to beg for them to take me out of my misery, they're too nice to tell me. So that's just, falling on deaf ears here. Thank you for tuning in today. And it is worth hanging in there with me, regardless of your personal feelings on the matter. I got you 2 for the price of 1 today. And it's even more exciting than that because it is, we are going to be speaking with David Montgomery and Anne Biklé. And I'm sure they don't need an introduction because I know you all will have at least one of their books in your exhaustive libraries. But if you haven't heard of them, David and Anne they're married. They live in Seattle and they are a pair of writers. And to quote them, Dave is a broad-minded geologist and Anne is a free-range biologist with a bad case of plant lust. And if that doesn't make you want to hang out with them, I don't know how much better I'm going to be able to do, but we did this sort of like a dinner party. Clearly, they are just super knowledgeable, but also very curious, constantly asking questions. And we get into some of the questions that they've followed in some of their many books. If you don't know their work yet, I really encourage you to look for some of what they've done. So Dave alone has written several books, including, but not limited to, Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations, and Growing a Revolution, Bringing Our Soil Back to Life. And then together they wrote The Hidden Half of Nature, The Microbial Roots of Life and Health. Super awesome book. And then their most recent work that they did together is called What Your Food Ate. We get into a lot of things. The reason I wanted to talk to them was not just because their book just came out, but because they have a really great way of going back sort of through the membrane of time and looking at some of the origins of our understanding about the connections between plants, soil microbes, our own health. And that is to say that from the Western and not to get too specific about it, but the sort of non-Indigenous perspective. And, just to be clear, there is a whole other history of following these connections, but they've done an outstanding job of just putting it really clearly why we need to be thinking about these things. And I can't recommend the books highly enough, but also just hanging out with them was super fun. Dave's mustache is like the mustache to end all mustaches. And I don't say that lightly, people. So real quick, want to say thank you to my buddies keeping the hate mail from me at the No Till Market Garden podcast. So thank you all. Thank you, listeners. And I hope you'll hang out with us. And with a word from Jesse, then we'll get right into the interview with David Montgomery and Anne Biklé.
Today's episode of the No Till Market Garden podcast is brought to you by Certified Naturally Grown. At the heart of sustainable ag is the belief that soil health and thriving ecosystems grow the very best food. Certified Naturally Grown is a grassroots certification program that recognizes direct market farmers using holistic methods and shows your customers that the products you bring to market are grown to the highest ecological standards. If you're looking for an affordable certification option that focuses on the thriving of local farms and foodways, you're going to want to check out CNG. Their peer-to-peer inspections create opportunities for farmers to connect, exchange knowledge, and build regional support between growers. Certify your produce, flowers, livestock, apiary, aquaponics, or mushroom operation today. Find out more at cngfarming.org. That's cngfarming.org. Today's episode is also brought to you by Johnny's Selected Seeds. Johnny's Selected Seeds is a proud sponsor of the No-Till Market Garden podcast. Since 1973, Johnny's has supported farmers and gardeners with superior seeds, tools, and information to help ensure their growing success and help feed their communities and families. The research farm is at the heart of Johnny's, where they trial thousands of varieties and tools every year. Their breeding program uniquely focuses on introducing varieties that meet the needs or solve the challenges mixed market, small farmers, and avid gardeners face. Visit johnnyseeds.com for innovative new varieties and time-tested favorites to grow this season. You can also browse their online growers library, link in the description, for a wealth of free educational resources. The employee owners at Johnny's look forward to growing with you. All right, enjoy the show.
Well, Anne and David, thank you so much for joining me today. It's such a pleasure to have you on. I know you're both really busy, so it means a lot to me that you would take the time today.
Oh, sure. Pleasure to be here. Happy to talk to you again.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, it would be great. I mean, most listeners are going to be very familiar with your work. You're both big heroes in the regenerative agriculture space. But if you could just tell us a little about yourselves, where you are, and since your story is going to be so familiar to so many, I would like to ask you both to reflect a little bit on what compelled you to write this most recent book, What Your Food Ate.
Yeah, I think, Mimi, when you start writing a book or books, you don't always know where they are going to take you. And What Your Food Ate, the most recent book, is definitely grew out of the other three, which in and of themselves, we call those ones the Dirt Trilogy. And in some ways, I think that intellectually, at least, I would have wanted to start with this book, What Your Food Ate, but that's not where we started. It began with Dave's first book, Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations, and that was sort of the long, sad story of what we have done to the soil. And professionally, before writing and doing public speaking, my field is environmental planning and biology, and I think it's also just kind of a part of my nature, and having a father as an engineer, whenever I see problems, I'm like, how are we going to fix this? Certainly there's something we can do. There's solutions out there. And as a gardener, and I think any gardener or farmer can also relate to this one, you're constantly sort of MacGyvering things, and every piece of ground is unique. Every sort of problem that a plant or an animal is having it's not totally unique, but it's like, this is funny. I haven't ever seen this happen this way. So you're always kind of innovating and thinking, how am I going to solve this thing with what I have right here, right now? Because that's really all I have. And that sort of led to at least my thinking on soil. Dave was on the erosion end and I was on the fix it end. It's not like he wasn't thinking of fix it, but I was thinking of like hands-on fix it. And that was sort of what led us to the hidden half of nature, and discovering, embarrassingly for a biologist and a geologist, that when we broke ground in Seattle for a garden, it was like dead dirt. I couldn't believe it. I'm like, oh my God, how did we miss this? This stuff is crap. These plants are going to die. So that was like the big fix it moment for me. It was what I call the organic matter chronicles. And, and then, so the hidden half of nature is the story, sort of parallel stories of microbiomes in the soil and also the human body. And I think it was that book that more than ever led me, at least, to realize and think a lot more about practices and how, in particular, farming, ag practices, and for that matter, medical practices, like what are they doing to our microbiomes? Because we now know that so much about soil health and human health, not entirely, there's never any one thing, but microbiomes have a big influence on function and health and overall well-being. And Dave got into his fix-it how-to phase when he wrote Growing a Revolution, because that was going around to farmers and visiting with them and finding out, well, what are your MacGyvers? How are you doing this regenerative thing? Dave's like going, oh no, MacGyvers. And it was quite clear from Growing a Revolution that what I had done on this little tiny postage stamp piece of our planet, farmers could do on vast acreage. And that was really, really exciting. They were bringing soil back to life as a consequence of their practices. So that was thrilling, right? How often has our species touched this planet or done something and actually really improved and enhanced environmental values in biology and ecology and air and water and all the rest of it? That's tends not to be the pathway that we take when we we get in there with the human touch. It's more like, oh, seems like we just have instead of 10 fingers, we got 10 monkey wrenches that we're jamming into all kinds of things. So anyway, that we'd long been thinking about a book somewhat like What Your Food Ate, because it was so clear to us after visiting farms, talking with farmers and all of the research and, human health. It's like, it's gotta matter what we do to the soil. It just has to matter what these practices are and what are they tweaking, influencing, and controlling in the soil. And what about those things then ripples through to crop health, animal health, and human health. So that's kind of how we got to this book, and this book being, the most recent or capstone one on the previous three.
Dave, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's when we got through, writing the first few books, we'd looked into enough about the way that how farming practices affect the soil and the life in the soil to start seeing patterns in terms of potential fixes, but also noticing that many of the things that sort of consistently came across as things that were influenced by farming practices that then affected the productivity and health of crops, the health of the soil, were things that you would be familiar with from the medical literature if you'd sort of looked into the kind of studies that had looked at things like omega-3 fats and on human health and antioxidants and anti-inflammatories and their role in helping to prevent chronic diseases. Many of the compounds that were sort of studied in those studies in the medical literature were the similar kind of things that the agronomic literature was showing could be affected by farming practices. So, the big motivation for this new book in my mind was trying to take those pieces and look at those connections between farming practices, soil health, crop health, animal health, and human health, because we tend to study them in academia as individual pieces, not as pieces of a grander puzzle. So we wanted to take a look into it so we could step back and try and look at formulating that bigger puzzle and the linkages between them. And of course, those aren't completely new ideas. People have been talking about the connection between soil health and human health for at least 80 years. But there's a whole lot of science that's been done in the last 80 years that Ann and I wanted to review, go over, digest, try and synthesize and write about it in a way that you wouldn't have to read the scientific journals to gain that insight. And one of the big motivations there is that academia tends to be stovepiped into our own little disciplines. And the connections we're talking about when we go from soil health to human health, they're fundamentally interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. And so you've got to read a lot in all those disciplines and then pull it together. And that's the kind of synthetic challenge that is well worth taking on. I almost said that we really enjoy doing, but I'm not sure that that's quite the right word. But it's something that we think needed to be done, and we dove into it.
Well, and I think it's something I kind of want to get into more later. This notion of the problems that we face and just the nature of biology in general is that it is not siloable. That we need to kind of depart from this very reductive model that we have for putting things into silos and start being, sort of consensus thinkers again, not consensus thinkers, but consilience thinkers. And it's one of the things that I love so much about this new book is that you really took your time to sort of tie details together as you went along. And I love that it wasn't just chopped up and then you try to stick it together at the end. So I have some follow-ups on that. But one of the things I wanted to kind of start with was that, you in the early part of the book, you give a lot of very well-deserved attention to Eve Balfour, who, a lot of people don't know her work, but was very inspirational to me. And I would love it if you would, speak to some of the experiments of hers that, really, had some place in your book, and why you went back to her work instead of, using some of the more modern studies that are out there, because I thought it was really poignant that you used her work as sort of that early sort of lead into the points you were making in the book along the way.
Well, a big part of the motivation for that is her story is really interesting. She was an amazing woman who probably hasn't received anywhere near the credit for the kind of innovative thinking that she was doing, and the synthesis that she did in the 1940s of the state of the science at that time, and then the experiments she did on her farm when she turned it into a research farm in the 50s and early 60s. But, she was there at the time when there was a lot of thinking about the nature of organic agriculture versus nitrogen-intensive agriculture in particular. And there's a lot of concern in certain elements of the nutritional community about what that was doing to the human diet and what food processing was doing as well. And she was one of the first people that really reached out and looked into the medical community and the agricultural community and tried to find the linkages between them and shine light on that. And Ann and I think, both really loved the idea that she had that, every hospital should have a soil scientist on staff to help advise how they should be growing the food to feed the patients to assist in their recovery. And Ann, I don't know if you want to add more about Balfour or any specifics of her stuff, but I think the idea of her as someone who's just so far ahead of her time that she didn't get credit for her ideas. As a writer, that is a compelling person to try and bring forward and elevate.
Yeah, I think there's not all books, that were written more than 50 years ago, 100, or go even further back and try to read some, Victorian English thing, like, say, The Origin of Species. And you're either game for that and you can navigate your way through it, or you're like, oh my God, give me a 2-minute read somewhere else on some blog post, because I can't do this. So with Eve Balfour's book called The Living Soil, it is eminently readable. What I sort of love about that book is, in writing, you always want to know point of view, whether in fiction or nonfiction. And the point of view tells you, where is this person coming from, or where is this idea coming from? And Eve Balfour makes no bones about it in her book, The Living Soil, exactly where she's coming from. And she recognizes the importance of soil. She has ideas and hypotheses about why the life of the soil, and the title of that book, The Living Soil, is so important. And she and Sir Albert Howard, kind of a contemporary, placed a lot of emphasis on fungi. And they also spent, I think, probably a whole lot of time handling, making, thinking about, and applying compost, and watching the effects of composts on crop growth, and mostly crop diseases in particular, because that was right before all the toxins and poisons really came on big in agriculture, because this was before World War II. And in any event, Eve Balfour was not only a farmer, she was really a pretty rigorous scientist in the way that she laid out these different trials and different fields at her farm called the Hockley Farm. And that work went on for, it's complicated to be running, to be keeping track of how you're rotating crops, what your different treatments are over multiple, plots and fields and time sequences and things like that. But you get into reading about the Biklé experiment, and it was clear that she knew the importance of good experimental design. She knew it was really important to be rigorous in all the treatments, the different treatments, because she and others were very much wanting to get to the bottom of this question about what is this thing that we're calling the living soil. And we sense and we know and we see, and anecdotally we understand that whenever soils are, these are my words, are more alive, we tend to have better outcomes with our crops and our animals. And so, that's the whole story that she unfolds in The Living Soil. And it's sort of unfortunate that that costs a lot of money as well to run an experiment like that over that kind of a time frame. And they ran out of money. She went on to form the Soil Association, which is still around in the UK, but they ran out of money and couldn't continue those experiments, which is unfortunate because she had a great start on things. But so that's a little bit about Eve Balfour, and I think in the time that she lived in the time that she was doing research, I think farmers were, I don't know, in some ways perhaps just more observant about what was happening on their farms, because they didn't have a lot of agrochemical, things compared to today. So you really kind of had to stay on top of that cow over there. That cow is looking sick to me, and I'm not sure why, or I think maybe it's these reasons. And, and then they would try to address it. And what I noticed a lot from reading stuff from that time period was how farmers, whether crops or animals, seem to be able to spot the onset or the very early stages of ailments or disease. And they would right away try to get on top of that, because they didn't have, they didn't have stuff like antibiotics and all of the other things that are sort of go-to products these days. So it's a really interesting time to read about farming and agriculture, because it's sort of the cusp between things moving into the industrial model that dominates today and coming out of the more sort of, I guess, I'm not sure what the right term for it is, pastoral or agrarian kind of times.
When I first read her book, I mean, it was quite a number of years ago, but I remember distinctly thinking, you almost have this haunting feeling like the problem was nearly solved and the future was saved. And I mean, it was so much that time you speak of, when there was this intimacy between landowners and everything under their care. And, you don't want to make broad generalizations about people and how they were, but they didn't have access to all of these tools that have diminished that intimacy. And I too was very struck by just how that read, it was an easy read, but also it was so haunting just to feel like, oh, look, she's solving the problem. And yet here we are. So yeah. And I love that there's such a nice kind of early part of your book dedicated to that bit of her work, because I think so many people have never heard of her. And all of these things, we've learned them before, it's just a theme. So one question I really wanted to sort of put in front of the two of you, because I know you think about it a lot, is that, increasingly the conversation around regenerative agriculture is focusing a lot on carbon. And it often gets me very exercised and almost driven to distraction, because I feel like it really polarizes people. A lot because the science on soil carbon, how stable it is, how much you can grow, blah, 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 blah. I mean, all those distracting arguments get in the way of this sort of undeniable and myriad benefits of putting soil health and healing the land at the forefront of our efforts. So when you were writing the book, I think it's at least clear to me that these are things that you're thinking about too. So how do you feel like this conversation can be more productive and maybe redirected before it's too late?
Yeah.
Anne, you want to go first, or?
Well, I mean, I think you just encapsulated everything that's really important in terms of how we think about carbon. And I have, I share the frustration that, okay, we can't entirely and accurately measure the kind of carbon, where it is in the soil profile, how long is it going to stay there, how much money should people get if they're putting carbon in the soil. And it quickly goes down this pathway that you kind of circles also back to your comment when we first started talking, which is basically about the variability and the dynamic nature, literally, of biology. And so all of these desires to quantify carbon and nail it down and so on are folly from the standpoint that it is fluid, it is ever changing, and the more we try to nail it down, the more it squishes out like an amoeba away from us. And it also very much detracts from the one just sort of unassailable point about carbon and soil health, which is, are you kidding me? Why would we not be looking to get any amount of carbon in any form, so long as it's a normal form and it's a part of cycling and all of that? I'm not, talking about doing weird technological things. I'm talking about just our normal nutrient cycles that have become so perturbed. And why would we throw our hands up and say, well, we can't measure this stuff, so it must not really, be worth us putting our time into it? I mean, you can, as long as we can get carbon back in the soil and get it circulating through life forms and stop thinking about this ridiculous notion that we can put it in a lockbox somewhere down under our feet and just stash the qubits or whatever metric you want to use down there, that then, we'll have solved climate change. No, I want to see more carbon circulating in life. And I don't really, care if that's, I want it out of the atmosphere and circulating in life and not getting caught up in arguments. Well, but microbes respire and there's methanogens inside of a cow, and we can't have these byproducts of life be generating more carbon, and we really need to lock this stuff up, and so on and so forth. So it just sort of, I think, and all of the COPE benefits, I mean, largely, the through line in what your food ate is, look, organic matter in the form of exudates, in the form of dead plants, dead animals, there's a lot of carbon in all of that stuff. And it's what keeps what Dave and I call the underground economy, the biological bazaar, thrumming and humming along. And when that biological bazaar is humming and thrumming like that, we get crops suffused with the compounds and molecules that keep them healthy and allow farmers to not buy inputs to fend off crop pathogens and diseases. And when you've got animals on, phytochemically diverse pastures that are, with all of these plants growing in healthy soil, same story in the animal body. And since we eat plants and animals, that ripples right on through to us. Why would we not avail ourselves of this huge untapped lever in human health because we can't figure out how to measure the carbon that gets into the soil? I'm just like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Talk about, what is that thing, cut off your nose to spite your face or whatever that is?
Talk about, yeah.
So anyway, that's my take on it, Mimi. I'm sure Dave has something more calm, perhaps, to say about that matter.
Yeah, I mean, the I kind of view carbon as the tail that's wagging the dog on this issue, in the sense that, the more carbon we can put in the ground and keep it there longer, the better, sort of end of story, the more the better. But how much carbon we can put into different soils at different practices around the world is going to vary an awful lot from place to place, just based on the climate, the temperature and precipitation in a region, the crops people want to grow, the kind of soil that they have, all that kind of stuff. But the kinds of practices that you would do to cut down on diesel emissions, on nitrogen use, on offsite nitrogen leakage, to practices to build up the nutrient density of crops. Those practices are pretty much the same practices you would use to enhance the soil organic matter content of soils. So there's multiple dimensions to why we would want to restore health and fertility to the world's agricultural soils. And carbon is just one element of it. Now, it's one that people want to put a price tag on, and we probably should put a price tag on it. People are arguing about how to measure it, and that's what scientists do. But when we talk about soil organic matter and carbon, it's something that it varies seasonally, it varies over years, and we're trying to measure, if you want to do carbon accounting, you're trying to measure changes across broad, complex geographies over time with a moving target that's oscillating. And so I think the way to do that is actually to try and set up demonstration farms in different regions where you could show through focused research projects where you could measure all the stuff that scientists want to measure, and evaluate, okay, how with a certain suite of practices, how much carbon in this region could you get with growing these certain kind of crops in this kind of rotation with this kind of technology, and then give people sort of credit towards that if they adopt those practices, without having to try and measure the carbon on every square meter of every farm to 3 feet depth and do it every year. You could do it with where you might do a measurement on a farm every 5 or 10 years just to see if you're keeping track or keeping pace with what you would predict regionally if you actually adopted practices that had been vetted on a demonstration farm. So I think there's ways around it that around some of the downsides of the issues around carbon, but that's not the way a lot of the conversation's going in terms of carbon accounting. There's a lot of like real accountants wanting to do stuff on a process that probably doesn't lend itself very well to that. And so we need, I think, a different regulatory framework, one that can empower farmers to enhance their land, but there's all those side benefits that can come with it in terms of environmental quality, in terms of enhanced yields with fewer inputs, and the direct contribution to climate that often isn't really sort of credited is the reduction in diesel and fertilizer use, which are huge sources of greenhouse gases in agriculture. Even if the soil organic matter content didn't go up on regenerative farms, but it does. But even if it didn't, you'd have a net climate benefit from adopting those practices because agricultural emissions would be much less. Now, will that solve the global carbon problem? No, we have to get off fossil fuels. That's what we have to do this century. But we also should reform our farming practices in a way that will help with that and help with a whole lot of other issues as well.
Yeah. Why not use all the tools?
Yes.
Just try a little dose, a tiny dose of common sense. That would be so great. So when you have been out and I know you have been out speaking and doing interviews and all the things, do you feel like this is truly a hopeful moment? Do you feel like that conversation is actually happening at the levels where policy could actually help support landowners who lack the resources and the knowledge to make transitions and have inherited a legacy of poor land use that they need to overcome? I mean, there are places where this transition is going to be more difficult. And tell me a little bit about how you're feeling about where those conversations are being had, how productive they are. Are you seeing change on the horizon?
I think we're getting there. I think we're actually getting there. We're not really quite there yet, but there's been a lot of progress. When I wrote Dirt back in 2007, I think it came out. There was nobody was talking about soil health or regenerative agriculture, and I sort of bringing the concept of soil health in at the end of that book was kind of novel for the time. But now you've got a lot of interest in it. You've got politicians talking about regenerative agriculture. How many of them actually understand about what it would take? That remains to be seen, but they're starting to pay attention. You've got movement in some policy circles. There's Tim Ryan, who was running for president last time, was talking about regenerative agriculture as part of his campaign. So I think there's attention. There was a lot of attention at the recent COP27 meeting in Egypt about soil and soil health. A bright light is starting to shine on the issue of soil health that's starting to reach into, more changes in farmers' practices as more people become aware of and educated in what it would take to actually do it. But I think we're also seeing a growing interest among consumers in terms of what it might mean for what's in their food, as we were writing about in What Your Food Ate. But there's also, I think, interest in policymakers about, well, maybe there's sort of another lever that we could sort of think about how to do. And so I'm hoping that over the next few years, and again, Ann and I, we take a bit of a long view, I think, in terms of change, but I see a lot of momentum building such that the idea that we might transform conventional agriculture into a more regenerative setting or footing in the next 20 or 30 years, and it will take probably that long, but that's actually pretty fast. When you look at radical social transformation of some of our basic environmental infrastructure, agriculture, that's pretty radically fast. And I think we're sort of at the point where change is accelerating, and if we can keep that acceleration up for another 10 years, we can probably play through over the next 20 or 30 years and have a real impact on agriculture globally.
Yeah. I was, we're starting to, we do online stuff, but we were recently, just last week at the Spokane Conservation District. So this is over in Eastern Washington. And I was really enheartened. That's a new word, I guess.
I like it.
Yeah.
Hey, write it down. We'll use it.
Hey.
It's a new book title.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see. I'll try again. Impressed and heartened by farmers who were there, because, like, I'm not a farmer, and the books that Dave and I write and in our public speaking, my main aim with all of that is to get information out to the kind of people who might benefit from it. Of course, if they're, interested in it beyond benefit, just putting information in the hands of people who actually are farmers and who work with farmers. And there was another speaker there. He was out of Illinois. And it was really interesting. He was sort of telling the story of his farm, and he's got thousands of acres, and he was there to basically kind of illustrate and demonstrate to the other farmers, like, look, this is how I'm doing regen practices on my farm. And it was pictures of, large pieces of equipment moving across a field. But here he's demonstrating, look, I'm knocking down this cover crop with the front end of this machinery, and the back end of this machinery is planting through this mulch. And here's what it looks like 2 months later. Look at this nice layer of organic matter I've got, and these new plants coming up through it. And here's things to think about, and so on and so forth. And I'm like, and he's got, data and pictures of his soil, which looks beautiful. And this was a farmer I really was impressed when he said, somebody had commented on, well, what about the edges of your fields or this or that? And he said, look, we're not looking for tidy here. We're not looking for what you all think of as a clean field. What we're doing is, biological farming, and this is how it's going to look, and this is what you're going to see. And so to have a farmer be able to tell other farmers what kinds of things they're doing in their region, what their impressions are, I think is really powerful. And then the other thing that kind of blew my socks off at that event was there's these two guys with big cowboy hats sitting in the front row, and I could tell these were not crop people; these are animal people. And so they were talking at one point, and boy, one of these guys went on about the importance of phytochemicals in the animal diet. And I almost fell out of my chair. 10 years ago, to have a rancher, an animal person, get up and start talking about how important the diet of an animal is, and not in terms of putting, muscle and fat on in, record time, but from the standpoint of the health of the animal, as well as putting on biomass, because that's what animal agriculture is all about. But presenting a much fuller picture to the audience of what is possible through a diet that's matched to what I call just the inherent biology of a ruminant. Why have we been screwing around with these animals with the industrial model? And I guess one of the things that really struck me in doing the research for What Your Food Ate was you read all these articles in the animal science journals, and probably 75% or more of these articles are about the disease problems and the wretched life of animals in a feedlot and what could be done about that. Now, most of the solutions offered are not about, maybe we should get the animals out of the feedlot and back into pasture. Those are not the solutions. The solutions are products like drugs, products like feed additives, ways of killing off certain members of the ruminant microbiome so that, they're not causing problems, dealing with the pH problems that a grain-fed diet introduces into an animal, and so on and so forth. But here was this cowboy, this rancher, talking about phytochemicals. And that to me was such a huge sign of a gain and hope. And I think a lot of people in the farming and ranching community are starting to see these things. And I hate to say this, but there's nothing like the price of something like fertilizer or animal feed to get somebody to change their practices. I mean, just look at, there's all these stories these days, even on people. Oh yeah, I went to the grocery store, I looked at the price of X, and then I walked right past that and went and got legumes. We're having legumes for dinner. So these price signals, I think, are good. Fertilizer, for a long time, these kinds of agrochemical products, animal feed and fertilizer, they haven't been priced in terms of what their true impacts are. Mm-hmm. So I think we're sort of starting to see that, and farmers are starting to ask themselves, do I really need to use as much as I have been? I mean, anything that costs more, you start thinking about more judicious use of it, or changing practices to get away from that particular input.
Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast is brought to you by BCS America. BCS two-wheel tractors are designed and built in Italy, where small-scale farming has been a way of life for generations. Discover the beauty of BCS on your farm with PTO-driven implements for soil working, shredding cover crops, spreading compost, mowing under fences, clearing snow, and much more, all powered by a single gear-driven machine that's tailored to the size and scale of your operation. We have been using a BCS tractor on our farm since 2014, and it has saved the day and leveled the workload more times than I can count. And I find new ways to employ it every single season. To learn more, view sale pricing, or locate your nearest dealer, visit bcsamerica.com. That's bcsamerica.com. To learn more, view sale pricing, or locate your nearest dealer, visit bcsamerica.com. That's bcsamerica.com. Today's episode is also brought to you by Rimmel Greenhouses.
Whether it's tomatoes to market, flowers in the spring, or your family's harvest, growing in a greenhouse protected from the weather provides the right environment that you need for a harvest that you can count on. Rimmel Greenhouses are designed for durability and offer the quality that you need to grow productively year-round. Visit rimmelgreenhouses.com to get a quote today.
If I may editorialize for a second, I own a Rimmel tunnel. I love it. We built it ourselves, and I really appreciated the quality of the tunnel as well as the customer service we received in the process. So make sure to check them out. All right, back to the show.
This is a great segue into another question I have, and it's hard to tee it up as a short question, but I'm a winemaker, and I also work with a group of ranchers on doing improvements in soil health. And I think about this all the time where, wine historically has really been, eating everybody else's lunch in terms of like the value add for quality and for those, those additions in phytochemicals that come from, a dynamic environment and the specificity of site and all of those things, which are certainly present in all of our whole foods that we eat and important and critical and do relate directly to the quality in as much as the quality is what nourishes us or makes us sicker. But there isn't the same premium. And, especially when I am talking or working with the ranchers that I work with, I feel so much sympathy for them because, you guys know that the label grass-fed doesn't necessarily mean grass-finished. And so there are these people who are trying so hard to do better by their land and really take an animal through a life cycle that is both healthy and free of stress and all of the things. But then they're fighting against this commodity price. And it also relates back to just a thing that has always been problematic for me in terms of like what I do for a living, which is sort of a classist food system and organic, biodynamic, now regenerative, the premiums that are going to start differentiating these products mean that a lot of the people who need the healthiest food are left out of that increase in quality. So, how are you guys thinking about this and what types of conversations are you having around this issue?
Yeah. That's undeniable what you just said, and it comes up again and again in conversations with people or at conferences about that issue and problem. And the way I think about it is I would like to see every farmer, whatever system they call their farming, organic, conventional, even regenerative, and so on. I want to see all systems move. Farmers everywhere can do something different tomorrow, next week, next month, next year to improve their soil health. And I haven't yet heard of a case where soil health improves, but resilience to these problems of drought and other climate things goes down. No, your resilience for that crop or that animal, when it's healthier, it goes up. And so move like this whole field of farming, the whole of every single farming system toward greater soil health, then you're getting more food out there into all the places that people buy food. That helps to sort of equalize this quality issue. And I kind of get irritated when farmers that align themselves with, one system or another, they'll pick at like one practice and say, well, that's not good enough. And therefore, all of conventional farming is bad because some conventional farmers that call themselves regenerative refuse to certify as organic or refuse to certify as this or that. And it's like, wait a minute here. That's like, you're going to throw away everything else they've done for the soil to improve its health just because of, this one thing. And I think, really the trick is if we change the mindset of farmers and farming practices so that everything is moving toward greater soil health, then all consumers, regardless of income level, can kind of reap that, proverbial harvest, so to speak. And that's what I would like to see happening over time, because I think that's how you're going to get to it. As soon as everything becomes, you've used the word premium, and that's a common way of talking about this, a higher quality, a premium for things. Well, why not make everything premium, right? There's no more junk. There's everything is having the nutrient density that is normal for that crop and that cultivar and so on. That way we can all partake of this. And that's a long ways off, but that's what I see we're working toward.
We essentially, as a society in North America, ran a grand uncontrolled experiment on ourselves starting at the end of the Second World War with trying to see whether subsidizing commodity crops and growing a lot of cheap food would actually not only feed everybody, but keep everybody healthy. And it fed everybody, but it didn't work to keep everybody healthy. And so if we look at sort of the regimen of subsidized cheap food, and conventional agriculture is subsidized in various ways, it led to expensive medicine, or helped contribute to expensive medicine in terms of back in the 50s, we spent about half as much on healthcare individually as we do on food. We spent more on food than on healthcare, and now we're spending twice as much on healthcare as we do on food. So, it's sort of across the economic spectrum. There's that kind of trade-off to consider when thinking about the sort of price of food. But I think what I'd love to see is a radical restructuring of our subsidy and agricultural programs so that we actually rewarded farmers and subsidized farmers who are adopting soil health building practices, so that we're basically lowering the cost of better food rather than depressing the cost of food that's not better, which is what we've been doing for 80 years. So when we look at sort of premiums and we look at sort of prices of things, I think it's hard to look at that in the vacuum outside the world of agricultural subsidies and regulations, because we've basically got our subsidies on backwards if we want a healthier food for everybody at a price point that everybody can afford.
And wouldn't it be so cool if the health insurance companies could carry that gap between healthy food and transitioning agriculture and call it a prescription? Wouldn't that be so cool? Anyway, that's my little fantasy.
No, yeah. And there you put your finger on the fact that agricultural policy is health policy. Mm-hmm. And yet we have these two, behemoth agencies in the U.S. government that don't talk very much.
No, at all, even.
Right.
It's crazy.
Right. Like, I have never understood why the folks that run the whole dietary guidelines thing, it mostly has turned into a war between macronutrients and the various interests around that. And it's like, what if we talk, there's never been any discussion in a deep way about how food is grown and how animals are raised and what that might have to do with the health of Americans. And the rejoinder on that from folks, in that space are, well, there's just not enough research there. Okay, if that is true in part, it's a long and complicated chain as we lay out in the book, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look more into it. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't immediately begin designing and carrying out research to better understand, sort of the higher level linkages that are in place and that we know to be true. Mechanisms and details to be worked out, but there is, I can't think of one amongst the 1,000 research papers that we read that said phytochemicals are known to harm human health. That just wasn't out there. And yet we're
Still
not talking
looking.
about, all we mostly hear is eat more phytochemicals. Okay, that's great. But what if our carrots and our squash and fruits and berries and all of that, what if the phytochemicals levels are depressed because of how we farm? Then we're taking in more calories to get sufficient levels of phytochemicals, and then you're running into, all of the diet-related diseases related to obesity and so on. So anyway, I love your idea. Let's get the healthcare industry involved in filling the gap so that everybody can enjoy, so-called premium food.
Yeah. Well, I definitely want to be respectful of your time, but I thought, kind of as we close, it would be interesting to kind of go a little bit deeper on this, this endpoint of human health, which, people care about because they tend to be interested in themselves. And just this notion of, when we started, we were talking about the complexity of the issue. And one of the best things about your book, I think, is how in detail and how much attention you pay to the relationships between organisms. And I, as a side obsession, really kind of fixate on the origins of life on Earth and how that first multicellular organism facilitated the next explosion in, kind of life on Earth. And at every point when there has been a major transition, and Dave, I especially think, as a geologist who thinks in bigger timescapes, that this would resonate with you, but at every point where major transitions have been made between epochs, there was a relationship involved, a sort of springing forward that was facilitated by a relationship that made a process possible or made a new substrate possible. These are complex things that we need to think about and pay attention to. And just as a sort of parting gift to the people who will hopefully go out and read your book, but also think about this afterwards, what can we learn when we study relationships instead of studying individuals?
I think one of the things that we learn is, as you're intimating, is that the idea of sort of cooperative engagement, symbioses between different species, is something that has received probably far too little attention in biology relative to its evolutionary and contemporary importance. And that's something that, Anne and I've kind of learned in writing this series of books. But I think that that's something that is, in hindsight, it's kind of obvious once you read all the literature and you put it all together and you understand all the stuff, but it's not where we tend to go to when we talk about nature and we talk about relationships between organisms. We often generally cast nature as a competitive environment, which it is at some level, but there's a complement to it, and that's on the symbiotic or the mutually cooperative level. And the idea that that's what's structuring a lot of the life below ground in its the relationship of soil life to plants and how important that is in agriculture really is actually a revolutionary kind of view on relationships for that very fundamental human activity in terms of trying to provide food for ourselves. And so I think looking at relationships is a good thing to do there. Can open our eyes to a whole different way of seeing things, and which opens our minds to different kinds of practices. And a lot of the science that we review in What Your Food Ate from the last 80 years really reinforces the importance of how unfortunate it was to overlook those kinds of relationships as we designed what we now call conventional agriculture.
Yeah, I mean, I think about that too, Mimi, about how is it that we've overlooked the importance of relationships in, on a farm, in an animal, in a garden, in a vineyard. And part of that, I think, kind of a thought experiment is, if there had been a different political and economic system in place at the time that Darwin and other contemporaries were thinking about these things and thinking about this, process called evolution, what might that have been? And one of the things that about in terms of relationship is you look at the coevolution between plants and pollinators. That you had talked about, one thing happening that enables a process or a function or something to occur when organisms come together. And that is totally the story of flowering plants and pollinators. And it's not just insects, it's bats, it's mammals, it's all kinds of things that began interacting with, these early weird little flowers that were not, what we think of as a flower today. And it was like, wow, the plant is getting its seeds spread around by these animals. And the very same thing, when the first plants, found themselves on land. So this is, hundreds of millions of years ago. And there they were, these twiggy little things, not much in the way of floppy leaves, because that's not going to do any good if you're, in the ocean. They get out onto land, and then there's all these microbes, and there's soil, and there's these relationships built around the root systems of plants. And so we overlook, on that metaphorical tree of life, just how all of these little branches developed and what allowed that to happen. And I've been thinking a lot lately about, because I think about plants a lot in particular, and how it is that we think about their diet, so to speak, and their life history and, the life of a plant. And what's interesting to me is that in agriculture and farming, we often talk about, especially when you're talking like nutrients and the topics that we take up in the book, there's a lot of the studies and research emphasize uptake of things sitting there in the soil, whether that's nitrogen or phosphorus or zinc or what have you. And so it's just this sort of very simple mechanical, physical, chemical thing. Plant sucks up this mineral from the soil, and that's how that stuff gets into the plant, which the plant needs. And yet, what's really been neglected, and I think what soil health is really bringing to the front for everybody, is that there's some relationship-based pathways by which compounds, molecules, and nutrients reach a plant. And so it's not about just some vacuum cleaner model of the plant sucking this thing up. It's about a plant cultivating a relationship with something in the soil that allows it to obtain something it otherwise would not have. And so I think these relationship-based ways of plants acquiring the things that imbue them with their own sort of onboard health system is something we need to look into way more, and that these things are nutrients. They're not just the things that spur plant growth. These are the equivalent of, this makes for the good life in the botanical world. When you have these relationships and you're not just relying on, roots to take up these things. And we've, it happens in all kinds of ways. I mean, this is how plants defend themselves against pathogens. These relationships, in fact, that plants carry on are why they have phytochemicals and particular phytochemical profiles. So this is really cool, right? Plants are never going to suck up a phytochemical out of the soil. They don't exist there. They exist in the biology inherent in the entire botanical world, and how the relationships that plants carry on allow them to build their own phytochemical profile is something anyone who grows a plant needs to know, a whole lot more about. Because there's these two main pathways. There is just the straight uptake from soil, but there's all this relationship-based stuff as well. So I'm just really intrigued by that. I call it sort of the dark matter of nutrition, in fact. It's about this world of things that we know is there. We don't completely understand it, but we know that things would fall apart without it. And so the more we can, I think, farm and make wine and raise animals in ways that kind of respect that unknown, because we need to conserve and preserve those processes if we're going to ever really truly learn more about it and use it for human benefit. So that's a question that gets me going, as you can tell.
I love it. And what a perfect note to end on. And I would just like to also draw attention to what kind of beautiful material comes from a book writing relationship that obviously has had lots of stimuli over the years to develop your own style and your own language, but also a way of sharing a relationship that clearly makes you both think better. So thank you so much for the work that you do. And thank you so much for sharing some time with us today. We will link to all of your books and your website and everything. But I just want to say, as individuals, you have contributed so much to, the acceleration of this very important conversation in this moment in time. But as a team, you really can't be beat. So David and Ann, thank you so much for your time today. And I look forward to the next iteration of your public relationship. And if you're ever in Oregon, I hope you'll let me fill a glass of wine for you.
Oh yeah, my hands are going. Yay! Yeah, yeah. We would. I would love that. That would be great. And I think just a kind of a last note too, right? Obviously, this notion of terroir and the idea about it is it's terra firma in the wine world and among winemakers. And though it may not be completely agreed upon, if we could start talking about the terroir of tomatoes and the terroir of squash and
oysters,
citrus, and all of these things, I think I really love using that concept more broadly, because I think intuitively people go, oh, well, of course, I always know my tomatoes are the best tomatoes, or there's always this one farmer who always has the best whatever. And it's a way of getting these really easily graspable concepts more out there into the food world. And so anyway, I thank the wine world for that.
Agree. The terroir of everything. It is a real thing, and it makes food sexier, just to use a French word. So I'm all in favor of that. Let's keep talking about it. Dave, any parting words?
No, I think Ann said it all. Thanks. It's been a pleasure to talk, and we look forward to that glass of wine when we're down in Oregon.
Awesome. All right. You guys have a great day, and thanks again for your time.
Thanks.
Bye. So that was totally like having a dinner party, because they were both there, and as a couple, they just were super entertaining to watch them play off of each other. But also, it obviously would have been better if we had been having a glass of wine together and sitting around a table. But in this age of connection via the web lengths, that was the best we could do, and I am so grateful to them for their time. Obviously, you should check out their books if you don't already have them and haven't already read them, referenced them, given them as gifts. And so I encourage you to seek those out and also look for them. They do a lot of speaking, and I'm certain, although we didn't ask or poke for a spoiler alert, but I'm sure they're working on something awesome. So we can expect more from them in the future, I'm sure. So thank you, David Montgomery and Ann Biklé. Thank you, Farmer Jesse, Farmer Jackson, Dr. Professor, and all of my friends at the Market Garden Podcast who are doing such awesome work. I aspire to be better for you, and I will see you all next time.
Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here, just jumping in real quick to catch you up on some of what we have going on. Our No-Till Growers YouTube channel, for instance, is back up and jamming again for another season of videos. So far, there is an onion growing guide, which includes why to not trim your onions before planting them, for real, with the science to back it up. A seed priming primer, an essential guide to market garden tools video, and more, and everything we've done in the past. Go over to YouTube and search for No-Till Growers and subscribe. That would be awesome. Also, the No-Till Growers forum is just absolutely booming with so much good nerdy info and conversation. It's free. It's awesome. Go check that out at notillgrowers.com. If you'd like to support this work or support the idea of keeping farming information free and open to anyone and everyone in general, you can pick up a copy of the Living Soil Handbook at notillgrowers.com or one of the no-till hats, which are back in stock. We've got merch there as well. The proceeds from all of those sales at notillgrowers.com go to supporting this work. If it's benefited you and you have the means to pitch in, that would be super rad. Or even better, become a yearly or monthly patron at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers, where not only may you get discounts on our stuff, but at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to Jessica Rhoda, Ryan Lewis, Bill Altman, and Stephen Smith. Huge thank you to everyone who supports our show in whatever way that you can. That Patreon page is the absolute lifeblood of our work, so we hope you will hop on board. And that's it from me. Thanks, y'all. We'll see you next week. Bye.